Thank you very much for the very kind words and the very kind introduction, and also for giving me the opportunity to speak at such a distinguished group, in front of such a distinguished group of people. And indeed, I'm going to talk today about the role of regulation of microplastics. What is important for those of you who are unfamiliar with the study of regulation, regulation is not legislation and it's not law. So regulation is about how one should regulate the different possibilities there are. So it's not about the legal system. For those, for example, who are now expecting to talk about what is out there in terms of laws, I'll unfortunately have to disappoint you. But I do hope that I can get you excited about regulation today. Now, some preliminary starting points that we need to agree upon, because when we talk about regulation, it's always important to first look at the object of regulation. So the interesting thing about microplastics is that there's actually no commonly agreed on definition on neither micro nor plastics. So we actually don't really know what is the object of regulation. Seems like everyone has an idea about how dangerous microplastics could be and why there should be regulation. When we really zoom into the definitions, it's really hard to find common ground. There seems to be some consensus in science that micro refers to below 5 millimeters, but that's more or less it. What is meant by plastic is also something that widely varies greatly among the differences. So here we already have a very first problem in terms of the regulatory object. What is it that we're actually regulating over here? If we then move further and ask the question why we should actually regulate microplastics, it becomes even more puzzling. If you look into the literature and research, we often find that there's no clear indication for human health risks. There's some indications for environmental risks, but still not so comprehensively that we can base regulation on the available data. Interestingly, we have a clear indication of benefits of using microplastics in products. So the benefits of using microplastics to humans and to certain other people are also clear. So at first sight, it looks as we don't actually see any real identified risk for human health. There might be some for the environment, but we have a lot of benefits. So why would we regulate? Why would you regulate microplastic if there's so many benefits? And the other, concerns are not so evidently clear. Well, what is also interesting, and that is something that we need to remind us, that there's huge public concern about microplastics. And if we look at the reasons for regulation, and if we look at the studies that have looked into the framing of the risks of regulation, they all point into one direction. That is that the framing of the risks by media attention has been so tremendously high that the public concern is also quite big to regulate microplastics. So from the perspective of a regulator, one should not forget that first and foremost, a response to public concern is more the motivation than the regulation of risks or benefits. Because if we look into other areas, for example, it's always a question, why would you start with microplastics and not other areas? If you look at other areas, there might be much clearer identifications of risks. So action might be much more warranted than here. But again, public concern is very high. And that might also explain why we see some of the regulations that we have at the moment the way they are. Now, let's look into what has been done so far. There is no real microplastic legislation. So we don't have any acts on microplastics and so forth. However, what we do have is a number of regulations, legislations, and principles which may also cover microplastics. And again, this is not a talk about legislation. This is not a talk about regulation, but it is indeed a talk of legislation, but it is indeed a talk about regulation, which means that we not look into the regulations and principles, but rather into the possibilities of regulation. Now, if you once again combine what we know about the regulation of microplastics, is that we have no clear evidence on hazards. We have no clear evidence of risk, and the emphasis here is on clear evidence of risk. Of course, there is evidence, but it's not clear. We do have clear evidence on benefits. We have large exposure because the sheer volume of microplastics is huge. We have large public concern, but we have no clear regulatory solution. So if you put this all in one bag, the question is then, what shall we do about this? What shall we do about these respective regulations? And this is a question of so-called institutional design. Institutional design is, according to Alexander, a very interesting, in my mind, in my field, I think highly underrated professor from Wisconsin, Milwaukee, has provided us with a nice definition of institutional design. And that is the devising and realization of rules, procedures, and organizational structures that will enable and constrain behavior and action so as to accord with held values, achieved desired objectives, or execute given tasks. So it's basically, this definition has two parts. Institutional design is first devising and realization of rules, procedures, and organizational structures. And the second part is then so as to accord with held values, achieved desired objectives, or execute given tasks. Well, the other way around, we have on the one hand how to do rules, with that will lead to a certain outcome. Now, if we look at the question of institutional design to microplastics, we also have to answer these two questions. Namely, the first question is, how can we devise and realize rules, procedures, and organizational structures? And here, the study of regulation also has developed several lines, several parameters that we can look at. So how to regulate? The first is a question, do we regulate at principles levels or at rules level? I'm going to get into a bit later, I'm going to get into practice a bit more deeper into what that actually means. Second question is, do we need an own legislation on the subject matter, such as a regulation on microplastics, or is an amendment of existing legislation enough? Should we regulate pre-market or post-market? So shall we regulate before microplastic enters the market, or should we regulate after it enters the market? What kind of regulation? Shall we use self, co, or state regulation? And finally, at which level shall we regulate? Local, meso, or meta regulation? So local regulation being, for example, national regulation, meso at the supranational, so EU, for example, and meta regulation at the international level. And each of them have their benefits and downsides. Now, let's first look into the question whether you should use principles or rules to regulate microplastics. Principles are so-called optimization commands. And those are the ones that natural scientists usually dislike a lot because they're vague. You don't really, you can't really grasp them. You don't actually know what to do. The precautionary principle, for example, or the principle that all goods need to be safe. What is safe? So there's So look at the positive principles. They cover a wide net. So they cover a lot of products or a lot of subject matters. And because of their relative wide optimization commands, they are also flexible for societal change. And therefore, particularly in technical regulation, principles are usually used a lot, because in technical regulations, a lot of new technical there's a lot of technical advancement, and so you need to be a certain kind of have some kind of flexibility to respond to social change. The problem is, though, that they're less predictable. So you don't really know if your action falls under a principle, if it's regulated as a principle. Now, though, rules don't have this problem. Rules are clear-cut. There's a clear definition, and there's a clear result. So rules are construct obligations and consequences when they are disobeyed. It's an if and then a clear phrase. They cover a tight net, clear definition. Everything that falls out of the definition is not really covered. The downside is there's very little flexibility because of the clear definition. However, you have a high predictability. So the market knows exactly what kind of behavior is expected. If we look at the next regulation, the next question, namely whether we should use own legislation or amendment, there's also several pros and cons. So if microplastics would be regulated by an own legislation, that would mean you can actually have rules which specifically look into the class and into the facets that microplastics actually have. So tailor them to the needs of regulation of the product. You can create new institutions in own legislation, which will also be tailored particularly to the risks at hand. There's usually a lot of clarity for appliers, simply because the microplastics all the terminology would be geared toward the use of microplastics. And that in general is an advantage, because the regulatory tools will be tailored towards the need of microplastics. In the European Union, we've seen such an approach, for example, in GMO regulation. So where the GMOs, genetically modified organisms regulation, enjoy specific treatment, despite of the fact that they could easily also be, for example, treated as novel foods, for example. But no, one had said this: we need a specific regulatory design to cover the risks from genetically modified organisms. Another option is also to have an amendment of existing legislation. So you can use existing institutions, you can use existing enforcement mechanisms, but however, you might also have lower exposure to the risks entailed with the microplastics. We have such an approach, for example, in the area of nanotechnologies, in particular with nano foods, because where the regulator basically said nano foods are regulated as novel foods, period. We have the novel foods regulation, and we just amend it accordingly. And now, from now on, nano foods are treated as novel foods. Whether this is sensible or not, this is something which is still out there for the judgment. Pre-market or post-market is another question to be answered. So on the one hand, if you regulate at a pre-market level, so before certain products enter the market, this is usually a more costly regulation, because you need to check the market and you need to have approval procedures in place. They can also work as a block for innovation, because you need to go through a certain procedure usually in order to get access to the market, or it's prohibited altogether, and therefore the innovation would never reach the market. Usually that is an increase in administration, because someone needs to control and administer all the pre-market approvals. On the upside, there's a huge information transfer, because once you enter a approval procedure, then you need to provide information to the respective authorities, and the authorities would then actually are able to act upon this information you provided. It's a very, very strong enforcement mechanism, and also it allows you to really assess the risks at stake. So it's a very, very clear enforcement of the risk management paradigm. If you regulate post-market, however, it's usually more flexible. It's, however, also harder to control. So if you have a real risk, it'll be out there in the market. And it's arguably less costly. but that is only the case if the harm done, if a specific risky product is on the market, would not actually spread the risks. Now, the next question one has to answer when looking for the right institutional design is the one of self, co, or state regulation. So self-regulation is, for example, regulation by industry itself. And hence, if industry itself has regulation, then also compliance is quite likely, as the regulatees design their own regulations. There can be weak enforcement, however, because institutions would not enforce self-regulation, but it's also a reflection of industry knowledge. So the industry knowledge would go directly into regulation. We have the same issue at co-regulation. Co-regulation is defined as a regulation where self-regulation and state regulation are intertwined. So basically, you get exactly the same benefits as self-regulation, but because of the involvement of the state, the enforcement of the regulation will be stronger. And then by the end of the day, you can also opt for state regulation. And that is the regular ones that everyone knows. That, however, means less flexibility usually, with strong enforcement powers because you have the respective public system. You have more administration, but there is information transfer, which is actually being provided. Now, come on. And finally, we have to look at which level. Let me show you regulate at local level, at meso level, or at meter level. At local level has the advantage that usually you can react to socioeconomic prerequisites on the ground, which is quite important. Better local flexibility, something changes on the ground. You've usually quite little coordination on the ground because you know the people, but you have big coordination once your regulative target moves outside. And also you have to accept that the regulative depth will vary according to the resources and professionality available at the respective level. There's also where you see, for example, now with Corona, it's always a question, at which level shall one regulate? Because of having exactly these different down and upsides. Now in meso regulation, you're able to gain economics of scale. So this might be more efficient. You also cover a wider area of regulation. So once you have transboundary regulative targets, you can also cover that. And there could also be better coordination, particularly for outside. If you look at meter regulation, it basically has all the benefits of meso regulation, but it's usually less flexible. And also that I forgot, it's very hard to enforce usually. All right. Now, if we've looked into these respective questions, now what is actually out there at the moment? What has been done, particularly at the European Union level? We see that microplastics had been basically covered by several areas, which is REACH, novel foods, food contact materials, toys, medical devices, the pharma code, and all these to regulate different aspects of microplastics at the moment. But the question that we still need to answer is, what do we need actually to regulate microplastics? And what is left for the member states to do still at the European Union level? So if everything is covered at the European Union level, what can they do? Now, we could, for example, question whether the regulation should be principles-based. And indeed, if we look into the European Union level, we do have a principles regulation in form of the precautionary principle. And the precautionary principle at the European Union level requires us to enforce a temporary ban. And if you look at the prerequisites that we see at the European Union from microplastics, namely that we do have very little actual data available on the risks involved with microplastic regulation, the precautionary principle might indeed be the one that can be triggered. But it does only allow us to initiate temporary bans. And those of you who are a bit familiar with the regulation at European Union level know that there is a ban being debated on intentional use of microplastics in products under the REACH regulation. The question is that actually something that is temporary? I'm not too sure about this. But what we see here is indeed we do have a combination of principles and rules-based regulation. So we do have the precaution principle, but then we have REACH regulation, which makes more concrete rules on the ban of intentional use of microplastics in products. Now, what kind do we, in the European Union level, apologies, do we have our own regulations or is it amendment? Well, if you look at the REACH, the European Union level, this is simply an amendment of the existing chemicals regulation. And the problem is then, of course, because REACH is only open for chemical substances only, what happens to all the other areas of microplastic regulation? And that's the downside, as we just identified, if you only regulate via an amendment of a legal system. Now, what do we find at pre-market or post-market level? Well, at pre-market level, we find a ban on intentional use of microplastics. And there's also uncertainty of the application of other acts, such as nanofoods, for example. So we do have some pre-market regulation here at the European Union level. But we also have post-market regulation, namely via the liability of member states' legal systems. Do we have state or co or self-regulation? Well, the ban on intentional use of microplastics is a definite state regulation. It's definitely state regulation. For self-regulatory measures, we have no indications so far. Do we have meso-meter or local regulation? Well, what we see here is particularly we do have a meso regulation at the EU level. I forgot to implement here. We also have some meter regulation at the OECD level particularly, and also local regulations at the country level of the EU. So each member state also have their own microplastic regulations with all the ups and downs that we just identified before. Now, wait a second, I'm dealing with Zoom over here, which makes my life hard. Apologies. Now, the question is then, what kind of regulatory agenda would we actually look at? Well, first and foremost, we have to make ourselves aware of the fact that regulation of microplastic is driven by media framing of environmental risks. So it's not based on real risk at the moment. That is, if we look at the current regulation, what has been identified in this absolutely excellent contribution, by the way, from Mitrano and Wohleben. In reality of what we know is that risk is not so much associated with size, but with the physical characteristics and the exposure of the respective microplastic. So if we just look into the size of a microplastic and then initiate regulation, that's what's currently been done, simply based on this, we might not, capture the real risks that are associated. So what can we do better? Well, if we look into the different aspects of exposure and also the different types of microplastics out there, we can roughly characterize the risk map accordingly, as Mitrano and Wohleben has done in Nature Communications. And it's quite interesting to see that also the respective regulations, how to look into, how to tackle these respective risks according to the respective categories, would then actually respond to the regulatory design. So if we go, for example, to the very left side over here, where we see basically orange, yellow, and red squares, those are the ones where waste management systems or product reformulations would be the most appropriate way of regulation. And interestingly, this is also the case because exposure over here on the very left-hand side is the risk factor. And therefore, waste management systems and product reformulations would be much more effective than bans, for example. If you however go to the far right, that is the blue and the green boxes, here, this is something that has to do with the with product characteristics. And this is indeed an area where bans might be an appropriate way of regulating microplastics. If we look in the middle, this is again something which has to do with the use of the respective regulations, not only exposure, but rather the use of the regulations. For example, 3D printing powders, polymer dispersions, coatings, and paints. So here we would not need waste management systems or product reformulation, but rather regulations on the use of the respective products. So we can limit the respective exposure of microplastics. And the question is then, how can we incentivize all this through regulation? Bans are pretty clear. This is straightforward law. But how can we incentivize businesses to initiate proper waste management systems, proper product reformulations, or also to make use proper exposure regulations? And this is indeed the question that needs to be asked. So how can we incentivize through regulation rather than only rely on bans? This is the solution that we have at the moment. So to sum up, we should not engage in knee-jerk reactions, but rigorous risk-benefit-based approaches. We currently have in the regulatory regime is a knee-jerk reaction basically to public concern. We need a mix of bans, exposure, use, and incentive regulation, which corresponds to the risks of exposure and product characteristics. And we also need that at meta level, simply because it is a concern around the globe. Thank you very much for your attention.